You're listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.
Well, hello and welcome to the Mammal Watching podcast with me, John Hall, in New York City.
And me, Charles Foley, also in New York City, where I happen to be sitting right next to John in his flat, as I am currently traveling to Europe, so I thought I would stop by and say hello.
And it's great to have you here, Charles. Very exciting to actually do this together in person. And I hear you were reading on the plane about Gunnarson's prairie dogs.
Yes, I was reading up on the work done by a chap called Kon Slobodchikov. I hope I've got that right.
About 200 points at Scrabble.
Yep. Slobodchikov, who's a professor of biology at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. And what he would do is he would record the communication of prairie dogs. And he realized that they had different warning calls for different types of predators, such as coyote, dog, hawks, etc., and that they would react differently to those animals. So if it was a hawk, they would dive underground. A dog, they might wait and watch to see where it goes, etc. Now, this communication behavior has also been found in other mammal species, such as vervet monkeys. However, what they then did was some experiments using graduate students, as one does, who walked through the colony of prairie dogs and discovered that these prairie dogs could actually construct sentences describing what a particular person or a predator looked like.
Wow.
So the prairie dogs could relay information about a person's height, about their body shape, and the color of their clothes. So, for instance, in one experiment, 3 slim women of roughly the same height walked through a prairie dog colony wearing the same clothes except for different colored t-shirts. And the prairie dogs chirped in a very different way for the different colored t-shirts. And in another study, prairie dogs actually changed the rate of their chirping to indicate whether a human was moving slowly or fast. So this means that a prairie dog might, for instance, say human, tall, yellow, fast, or coyote, big, brown, slow. And they even found that the prairie dogs actually produced a specific call for an individual person who had been shooting a shotgun into the ground. Now, some people are skeptical whether this constitutes true communicational language because while the predator alarm calls trigger distinct escape responses, so far the researchers have not been able to link the chirps and the calls that supposedly are linked to color, shape, and height, etc., to any perceivable change in behavior. So it's difficult to extract meaning from it. However, personally, I think it's fantastic research, but I'm just not sure how I feel about it. I mean, just imagine me walking out into a prairie dog colony and the dog starting to chirp, tall humanoid approaching, bit tubby round the waist, terrible clothes colors. I mean, it'd be a nightmare. And frankly, John, I think I prefer my rodents to be a bit like my daughter's hamster. Very cute, but a bit vacant upstairs. And certainly not having them pass social commentary about my appearance. I mean, it's all right for you. You live with just Amber and your dog, but I live in a household with 4 women. And I already get plenty of feedback about my appearance, seldom being flattering. And so I don't think I'd really need prairie dogs to be added to the mix as well.
That's fine. I can assure you I get plenty of comments on my appearance too, and if Butter could speak, she would be joining in. That's incredible. What a great story. I mean, that's just... I want to know more about this. Wow, wonderful.
And you just wonder then, what do some of the other animals like, for instance,
Exactly.
some of the great apes, etc., what are they saying about us?
Amazing. So Google Translate will have an app for this in 10 years, and the prairie dog will just put your phone up and it'll tell you exactly what they're thinking of you. Wow, that's a fantastic story. Very good.
And so, John, you have been telling me about a new fancy camera that you have just ordered.
Yes, Charles, very exciting, a new toy. So when I was in Ecuador a few weeks ago, I dropped my camera and I was convinced it stopped working or the lens was broken. And I've been thinking about moving to a mirrorless camera for a while. So I got home and started talking to people. My friend Ignacio in Panama, Ferre, he told me to check out these videos on YouTube, and I did, of the new Canon mirrorless, and it's extraordinary. So as soon as I saw these videos, of course, I was lost. That was it. I had to have one, even though I now find my camera's not broken at all. But yeah, this new mirrorless camera has got this artificial intelligent focusing system that tracks animals' eyes. And although it's not perfect, especially apparently for larger mammals, it can zoom onto the wrong bits. It can go onto a nose or an ear tuft. For birds, it's just extraordinary. You check out some of the reviews on YouTube, but the camera works out where the bird is, and then it zips onto the bird's eye. And once it's on, this bird will just follow the focusing, and exposure will follow the bird as it moves around. So if you're taking something of a fast bird in flight that might be going through trees or with a difficult background, you'd have no chance of focusing with a regular camera. This thing just locks on and it keeps taking 12, 20 frames a second. So it's just extraordinary. So yeah, I'm looking forward very much to trying this thing out. It's going to be a bit of a learning curve, I'm sure, but it's the stuff of science fiction.
Wow. And does it look pretty much just like your regular SLR camera, or different shape, or?
No, it's, I mean, one of the
characteristics?
One of the selling points is it's very similar. So if you're used to using a Canon SLR, you can move on to this mirrorless one. The controls are basically the same. It's smaller and lighter, which is also a selling point if you're on a hike. So I'd say maybe 20 to 30% lighter. Mm-hmm. And another great thing is that you don't need to buy a whole new set of lenses. All the Canon lenses and gear I have will work with it. And there's an adapter, but there are new mirrorless lenses coming out that are smaller and lighter than the regular ones, but you don't have to wait for those. You can use the gear you have. So it's we'll see how much of a mess I make with it, but in the right hands, it could be a fantastic thing.
Wow, sounds incredible. Yes, and again, being able to use your old lenses is really the clincher, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I would never have thought about doing it otherwise, but
yeah,
this was
great. Well, look forward to hearing how it pans out for you.
Yeah, I can't wait to turn it on and use it.
So our guest today on the podcast is Dr. Peter Zahler. Now, Peter has spent 35 years working in the conservation world, from Alaska to Tajikistan, from Venezuela to Afghanistan. He served as the Asia Regional Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society for many years, where he designed and set up their Pakistan, Mongolia, and Afghanistan programs. And these programs are considered cutting-edge examples of community-based conservation initiatives that work with local people, governments, as well as businesses to help achieve lasting conservation impacts. Peter also helped create the WCS Arctic Beringia program and supervised conservation programs and projects in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, the Russian Far East, Central Asian states, Iran, and China. And his work has also helped protect a wide range of large mammal species, including the Amur tiger, Asiatic cheetah, Markhor, Marco Polo sheep, as well as the Tibetan antelope. And perhaps most importantly, his work has led to the formal protection of over 20,000 square kilometers of wild lands, from community-managed conservancies to new national parks. Peter serves on multiple specialist groups for the IUCN and has authored over 65 scientific publications and book chapters. In 2018, Peter joined the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, where he now serves as the Vice President of Conservation Initiatives. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Charles and John, thank you very much for having me.
Very good to have you here. Now, Peter, as I mentioned, you are working in the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle as the Vice President for Conservation Initiatives. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing in this role?
Sure. Woodland Park Zoo is a really cutting edge organization in terms of the idea of focusing on conservation. We have programs around the world that we support in various ways. Our two biggest ones are one called the Living Northwest program, run by Robert Long and Katie Ramine, which is really focused on work in the Northwest region around Seattle and Washington State in general. It looks at everything from wolverine recovery in the Cascades to carnivores in the downtown Seattle area, where people are actually learning about the fact that they share their land with not just chickadees and starlings and pigeons, but also bobcats and coyotes and so forth. We have a nice map that actually shows you just where the bears are if you wanted to find out where bears are in the greater Seattle area. We have programs on recovery of the western pond turtle, which was down to about 150 animals until our program of head starting, just like you do with kindergarten kids, that saves them from being eaten by bullfrogs when they're very small. So they're now up to over 1,000 animals in the wild, which is pretty exciting. We also have a very big program that's been operating for the last 20-some years in Papua New Guinea that is a real great example of cutting-edge community-based conservation. It's run by Dr. Lisa Daybeck and Trevor Holbrook, and they're working with now 50 communities across an area in the highlands in Papua New Guinea. It's a really wonderful program in that it combines livelihoods, conservation coffee, education, health, research, and wildlife conservation focused primarily on tree kangaroos. And we also support programs.
That's the Matches tree kangaroo?
The Matches tree, yes. There are a couple of different species, and that's the one that's found in our area. They have. I started working in Papua New Guinea many, many years ago, supporting a program there. And one of the terms that I've often heard used is that Papua New Guinea is a place where large conservation programs go to die. It's an incredibly hard place to work. It's over 90% of the land is in customary ownership, which means local people own it. So you can't just plop down a big national park to save a region. And there are 850 some languages in the country. So it's not an easy place to get communities to come together and work together. And Lisa has managed to do that over the 2 decades of work there in a really, really unique way. So we also support programs. We started the Malayan Tiger Program, focused on trying to save Malayan tigers in the country. And we support about 25 other programs around the world doing conservation, from penguins in Peru on down the line.
Wow, that's what a fascinating job. I mean, we could have you on for a whole episode just talking about Papua New Guinea and tree kangaroos. It's a country that I'm desperate to visit after reading Tim Flannery's book, Throwing Way Leg, about his work there with tree kangaroos. But we can't do that right now. So thank you for joining us. As Charles said, you've worked in some really exotic and difficult countries, like Pakistan and Mongolia and Afghanistan. And I know from what Charles has told me that in the mid-90s, you rediscovered the woolly flying squirrel, a mammal that has not been seen by any scientists for 70 years. What an achievement. Could you tell us a bit about how that happened?
Sure. You could say it was serendipity. You could say it was idiocy. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. It's probably some combination in there. Yep. Basically, what happened is I've been doing field research for a number of years, and some of it had been on birds, and I decided I wanted to really focus on mammals. So I narrowed it down, because I'm a field guide junkie, to 2 choices: the aquatic genet of the Congo in Africa and the woolly flying squirrel. Because again, I was looking for an animal that really needed someone to work on their behalf, something that was probably in danger in some form or fashion, but nobody really knew much about. I didn't want to go work on tigers like everybody else did. Yeah. Something new and different. And I'd been in the tropics. I'd worked on Watsons, which is a very strange punk rock-like bird in Venezuela, and I sweat a lot. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go to the dry Himalayas of Pakistan and find this woolly flying squirrel. I very luckily didn't realize that most scientists thought it was extinct. It, as you mentioned, hadn't been seen for roughly 70 years. And I went over there and did a survey for them, and trapping sort of everything that you might be able to get in the region: baby red foxes and stone martens and all kinds of really interesting wildlife, but no woolly flying squirrels. But I also discovered that it was a place where there could literally be 100 flying squirrels right above my head on a cliff face, just having a great big party, and I'd never know it. It's one of the steepest areas in the world. It's where the confluences of the Himalayas, the Karakorams, and the Hindu Kush come together. So it's got over 100 peaks that are over 20,000 feet in elevation. Yeah. Just enormous. K2's in the area. Nanga Parbat, which is the 9th highest mountain in the world, is right across from the main study area where we were. And so I went back again a year and a half later after I raised some funds, and we actually did manage to come across one, which was, again, serendipity and stubbornness and perhaps idiocy. But I'd gone up into a side valley called Sai Valley, and I had been told at when I was planning this, to check in with the police base that was situated at the mouth of the valley. Just because it's a little dicey valley-wise. It's a very fundamentalist region. People are considered to be very unfriendly to outsiders, and it's good to just let people know that you're there. So I stopped in the police station. They asked me what I was doing, and I told them I was looking for the woolly flying squirrel, which is known as chergay in the Shina language that's there. And they all started laughing. And when I finally got them to stop, they told me that the animal in question produces a material that's used as an aphrodisiac, which they just thought was the funniest thing in the world. But I had heard everything at this point. I had heard that they milk goats in the high pastures and that they hang by their feet in caves like bats. Mm. So I just sort of wrote it off and went up into the hills. And the material is called sologite, by the way, supposedly. So we went up into the hills and caught a bunch of animals that weren't squirrels. And eventually a big fellow, a local fellow with a big beard and the shalwar kameez and a kalashnikov on his back, came into our camp and said, "I hear you are looking for chergay." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You'll give me money if I find one." I said, "Okay, you got the gun." And he said, "Give me that bag," which is a bag of potatoes, I think that was nearby. And so I emptied out the potatoes and gave him the bag. And he went away. And 6 hours later, he came back with a woolly flying squirrel in the bag. And this is because the squirrels, which are enormous, they're 4 feet long from the tip of their nose to the tip of their tail. It's the largest squirrel of any sort in the world, largest glider, in fact. Just as a point, for those who don't know, flying squirrels don't fly. They glide. They have a membrane between their front and back feet, and they spread those out and jump usually from trees, because most flying squirrels are small, and glide from one tree to another. The woolly flying squirrel is so big that they can't live in tree holes for the most part because there aren't tree holes big enough for them. So they live in cliff caves, which is a pretty easy thing to find in an area like northern Pakistan, where there's so many mountains. So the only people that know about the woolly flying squirrel are these sologite collectors. It turns out there is indeed a material called sologite that is collected by sologite collectors and processed into something that's sold as an aphrodisiac and also for other medicinal benefits. And they're the only people who know about the flying squirrel because they go into these caves and they collect this material. So that was the secret to flying squirrels.
Absolutely fantastic.
This guy comes into your camp. He drops down the bag, and there's obviously something bouncing around in it. What were you thinking at this point?
I just sort of went into scientist mode. I sort of immediately thought that's a woolly flying squirrel, which is a completely insane thing to think. I mean, it should have been a baby red fox or a stone marten or something, but I felt immediately that's a woolly flying squirrel. It kind of looked like the right size. And we got it out of the bag and into a big live trap, raccoon-sized live trap that we've been trying to catch the squirrels with. And yeah, it was a woolly flying squirrel. And we just stared at it for a really long time.
Was it maybe docile? Was it kicking and screaming?
They're incredibly docile. They're about the size of a raccoon. They have sort of a raccoon shape to them. They're much lighter than a raccoon, but because they have very thick fur and the patagium, the blinding membrane, sort of covers them almost like a cape. It looks like a very thick-bodied creature with a small kind of pin-headed squirrel head, and then a huge, long, cylindrical tail that's very much like a red fox, except the whole look is gray. So they're big animals, but I've picked them up just literally without any kind of anesthesia and done measurements on them. And, they kind of kick around a little bit, but I get bit by pretty much everything I've worked on, and flying squirrels have never bitten me. So.
Wow. And they live at it. They get really, really high, don't they? I mean, how high were you? Where you?
We were at about 10 to 11,000 feet in elevation, and so it turns out we collected a bunch of pellets. This guy produced 900, I think, overnight. We kept it overnight, and then we released it at the cave where it was collected the next morning. And we had those analyzed, and it turns out there was a reason why I wasn't catching woolly flying squirrels. It was because their food seems to be about 90% pine needles, which is completely insane. I mean, very few animals eat pine needles. They got really horrible secondary compounds. It's a waxy material that's really hard to digest. But if you figure it out evolutionarily, you have a super abundant food source. But it explains why using the sort of things that would attract a normal squirrel, like a city squirrel or something, just wasn't working with these guys. They weren't interested in nuts and berries and cheese and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it also explains where you find them in the mountains, because they don't occur very often above tree line. They're dependent upon these pine trees.
And do you know how the trapper actually caught it? Did he just walk into the cave and grabbed it? Or
well, they climb up or rappel down to these caves, which are on very sheer cliffs, quite dramatic to watch and a little unnerving. And yeah, they just go in and they pick up the squirrel, dump it in the bag. It's, as I mentioned, they move like a raccoon. They're not very fast, and they're very docile. I can't really explain it.
Wow. It must have been an amazing experience just opening that bag and looking in and seeing it.
I got someone sent me from Bhutan a camera trap picture a couple of months back. It was a strange animal, and I thought it might be a woolly flying squirrel looking at it, but it really, I was convinced it was something else. But we sent it to others who know more about this than I do, and it was a woolly flying squirrel. And it was on rocky ground, sort of on the ground, obviously, and I think fairly far from trees, if I remember, but there were trees in the area. But
yeah, I know about this. It's actually really interesting. The squirrel was thought to be, after I rediscovered it, it was thought to be endemic to Pakistan, and in a very small area of Pakistan, in an area called Diamar district for the most part. And I'd searched around on the outskirts of that area and was not finding anything. It was only known from 11 study skins, most of which were collected in the 1800s. And one sighting of a live squirrel by this guy, Colonel Lorimer of the British Army in Sai Valley, which is where I caught the first one in 1994. He took a picture of it, and that was sort of the only living animal record for woolly flying squirrels. But the skins that had been collected, a couple of them had come from rather interesting areas. One was from Yunnan in China, I believe. And the assumption at the time was that it was a skin that just traveled on the Silk Route. It had been collected in Pakistan and moved. But it now turns out that there are probably two other species of woolly flying squirrels. One of them in Yunnan, and I can't quite remember where the second one is. Possibly it was, as you mentioned, Nepal or Bhutan. But it's very. This all just came about in the last year and a half. The discovery that there are other species of woolly flying squirrels.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Wow.
Do you have any inkling of how the population is doing in that valley where we discovered them?
I have made guesstimates. And the nice thing is that when I was up there, I realized very quickly that if I continued to just do research on this fascinating animal, I would be documenting its extinction, because the trees were being cut down at a really astonishing rate. Local companies in Pakistan were coming up into the hills. And this is a really isolated place. The people live mostly in stone huts. There's no electricity. There's no running water. It's really back country living there. And they would go, the companies, they're called the timber mafia, which gives you an idea of what they're like. They would go into these valleys and they would buy the rights to the trees. So this is a fundamentalist area that's tribal. So they never lost to the British, they never lost to the Pakistanis. And so they have full rights to their land, much like in Papua New Guinea, in fact. They have the rights to their land and to the wildlife and the trees. But the timber mafia would come in and buy the rights to clear cut their valleys and just decimate them. And they'd pay peanuts because, of course, the local folks had no real idea what timber was worth in a place like Pakistan, where there's almost no trees left. And so I turned around and started a community-based conservation program to try to save the region and the squirrel itself, who was dependent upon the trees to feed, as well as pretty much all the other wildlife there was dependent on trees there. And weirdly enough, I tended to be pretty successful at it. And again, I'm not quite sure why, because again, this is an area that the guidebooks, when I first went up there, you weren't supposed to stop your car in the area. And one of the guidebooks had this line that I still remember. It was an interview with a policeman. And he said, "There's only one thing wrong with this area: murder, 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 murder." I just thought was a great line. But the people were incredibly gracious in terms of hosting me. I never had a problem there. A few moments of nervousness, but in general, they were just incredibly kind.
Yeah. Wow.
And Peter, when you were working in Pakistan, you were also instrumental in helping set up a conservation program for the Markhor, which is a species of wild goat with fantastic spiral horns, which John actually talked about in his podcast not so long ago. And I know this has turned out to be an incredibly successful conservation story. So can you tell us a bit about how you went about working with the local communities in this to set up this program?
Sure. I basically what I did is I sat around in potato fields for 2 or 3 years, pretty much, talking or listening to village elders describe what they thought problems were in their valleys and talking back about some of the things I was thinking. And really just a very slow process of gaining their trust and starting to figure out what they might actually need in terms of conservation. And I knew I wasn't going to have a successful conservation program based on a squirrel. That's just not going to work. But as you mentioned, there is another animal in this area called the Markhor, in this case, the flare-horned Markhor, which is a subspecies. It has these enormous, as you mentioned, spiral antler or horns, very much like the greater kudu, if you know that animal from Africa. And these are enormous goats, great long beards, incredible climbers. They can go up the sides of what really looks like sheer cliffs. And I've seen them in oak trees, actually up in the trees, feeding on leaves.
So have I, yeah.
Spectacular animals. And I thought, that's the ticket. It's the national mammal of Pakistan, so it has a lot of credit across the country, and local people really valued it. It was an animal where usually there was like one shikari, one hunter in each of the communities that would go off with their blunderbuss and shoot a Markhor. But nowadays, of course, every 10-year-old has a Kalashnikov because of the advent of conflicts in the region that led to a lot of weapons being available. And if you give a 10-year-old a Kalashnikov, they're going to shoot things. That's just what 10-year-old boys do when you give them a gun. And so Markhor were just disappearing at a fantastic rate, just really unbelievably quickly. They were considered to be critically endangered in that part of Pakistan. And so I thought, okay, let's work on Markhor as an animal, as sort of the flagship for this effort. But it was going to be all community-based. And I was very lucky in many ways, one of which was that the tribal areas here were very hierarchical. So if you can get the village elders on board, the whole valley falls in line. And so it was surprisingly easy to get them to come on board. There was very little disagreement because of how tight-knit the communities were. And there's virtually no poaching from outside of a community. So each of these communities are essentially in a watershed, giant mountains on either side. And historically, they had their own kingdoms. They would be at war with one another just around the corner in the next valley. And because of that, people didn't come across to poach in another community because that would, you'd have a blood feud for the next 100 years. It just didn't happen. So if you could get that community to say, okay, we're not going to shoot Markhor anymore, and we're not going to cut down trees except through a series of bylaws that a committee that was created would put in place, then you could actually do a really good job at saving the environment. And this is an environment that the local people were absolutely dependent on. There was almost no other way to make a living than to feed your family. You had little tiny crops that were sort of carved out of land on the sides of these cliffs. And then you would also have goats and sheep that you would take to the high pasture. And that was pretty much it. You'd collect, pine nuts. They have pine nuts there, very much like the pine nuts that you can pinyon pine and other nuts from Italy that you can buy in the stores. And they could actually sell those, and morel mushrooms and a few other things. And they sold potatoes. And that's pretty much the economy of the area. But so it was very much based on natural resources, and natural resource protection made perfect sense. So we ended up putting that in place. We worked on, I think it was a total of 64 valleys by the end of the work. That we had creating new governance structures around natural resource management, put in bylaws to protect Markhor and forests and other wildlife. And then eventually we ended up combining these into multiple communities, because one of the tricky parts is that Markhor don't live in a watershed. They live on the tops of mountains, and they'll cross these watersheds and move about. And so if you have one community that's protecting Markhor and the Markhor move into the next community that shoots all the Markhor, you lost out. So we ended up, and again, because the sort of tribal enmity, it took a long time. This is a 20-year effort, really, from start to finish, where these communities eventually came together and joined into conservancies, 22 different conservancies that protected much larger landscapes across the region, about 10,000 square kilometers altogether.
Wow. And what was the original impetus for them to protect the Markhor? I mean, was it protecting the forest, or was it? I mean, why were they? How were you able to convince them that these Markhors should not be shot?
It wasn't convincing. They knew that the situation was bad and getting worse. That the trees were being cut down, that the Markhor were being hunted out, but what they lacked was a system to actually do something about it. They were just sort of more on the "this is really bad, something should be done" stage of thinking it through. They had hundreds of years of a system that had worked up until now, and now it kind of wasn't working. But they're very formal and straight-laced, and they don't change easily on their own. So they were trying to figure out what they could do. And I came in and basically said, okay, well, here's a few simple things you can do. Create a committee to make decisions about natural resources, and create bylaws that will allow the community to understand what they can and cannot do, and just make those the rules.
Right.
And they're like, yeah, of course, let's do that. And so they understood that the timber mafia was a bad thing. And I helped explain it. I talked about the worth of each one of these enormous trees. They have spruce and fir and pine up in there. And some of them just had enormous trunks, really quite impressive trees that were probably worth, tens of thousands of dollars for an individual tree when you take it all the way down to market. And that, they just had no clue. So understanding that was like, okay, you have to get permission to cut down a tree if you need to build a house or for firewood or whatever. You can collect down timber, but otherwise these are the rules. And each valley did their own set of rules as they felt was particular, but they all fell sort of in similar line because they were modeling those decisions from one another after the first couple of valleys started to do this. And more valleys wanted to join when they heard about it, which was really great. It was a word of mouth process. People would come to us and say, we want to join this system.
Right.
That's amazing. I mean, sometimes as someone who works in development, you can get a bit sort of jaded with stories of things that haven't worked. And then I hear something like that, which is, it's been extremely successful. I mean, it's held up as a real true success story, but it's such an inspirational story of such a complex set of issues, and you navigated through it. It took 20 years, but really that's just exceptional. That's a great story.
I barely speak a word of Urdu or Shina or Rushaski or Waki or Balti or all the other languages that are up there. Partly there are too many languages, partly I'm just bad at it. Mm-hmm. But I felt relying on a translator was a really smart thing to do, so I wouldn't stick my foot in my mouth. It's a bad place to do that.
Yeah.
And how are the Markhor doing over there at the moment? I know that there's other projects have set up a system of having foreign hunters come in and pay huge amounts of money to shoot a few Markhor over there as well. What's the current situation like with the Markhor in that area?
Markhor are doing fantastic in that region. The population is, when I got there, the estimate was about 1,000 Markhor in the total region. It's about, again, 10,000 square kilometers. And now there's an estimated, some 5 or 6 years ago, it was at 1,700 and growing rapidly. I'm sure it's got to be over 2,000 animals right now. So a really dramatic upward swing. I mean, one of the nice things about ungulates in general is if you don't overhunt them, they do really well. They breed like rabbits, essentially. except they're goats in this case. And it's just it's nice to have seen that. The program you mentioned is actually an interesting one. Trophy hunting very rarely works well. Pakistan's an interesting example of where it does seem to be working well. They have Markhor actually worth between $50,000 and $100,000 an individual male on the open market. And eventually it did come to my area. The government instituted a trophy hunting program because in America they're doing so well. There are only 4 permits allowed per year. So a maximum of 4 male animals can be taken out of this population. And the hunters pay $50,000 to $100,000 for a permit, and 80% of that goes back to local communities. And it actually gets back to local communities. I've seen this happen in a lot of other countries where that whole system is put in place to varying degrees, and the money never makes it back, for the reasons you can obviously understand. And that's an incredible disincentive to actually take care of your natural wildlife before. But when people who basically weren't making anything suddenly have access to funds that they can create a medical dispensary or build a mosque or a school or pay a teacher, it's pretty dramatic. Even though most villages don't benefit in any one year because there's so few permits allowed. But again, by linking them up into conservancies, more and more villages actually do get to benefit because the conservancy is the one that benefits, not just the individual village if the Markhor is hunted in their area. So yeah, it wasn't something that I went into this region planning on instituting. It was put in place by the government, but it's turned out to be a pretty effective incentive beyond just the sort of the understanding that Markhor are interesting, cool animals that we want to have around. But there's also a real value to them that's monetary.
Right. And presumably there's now virtually no poaching of Markhor in that area?
Virtually none. Again, the local communities aren't going to, it's the golden goose situation. You're just not going to hunt them. But also the structure of the tribes is such that no one is going to go out there and do that. If the general word is don't do it.
Wow, fascinating.
So you've seen some amazing wildlife, obviously, in these incredibly desolate areas. And besides the woolly flying squirrel, which is clearly would be a highlight in anyone's book, what is your next favorite mammal sighting that you've had in the area?
Wow, in the area. I would probably have to say Markhor, just because there's such spectacular beasts. Although, frankly, one of my favorite, I like little animals. I'm a fan of small mammals in general. And I once had a migratory hamster run across my shoe. And for some reason, that memory will always stick. So migratory hamsters are tiny little balls of fluff. They're tiny, they're round. They're not very bright, I think. And of course, they're not migratory. So much like the woolly flying squirrel doesn't fly, and the mountain plover doesn't live in mountains. It's another animal I studied in southern Colorado. And the fisher doesn't fish. It's named after probably the French word fiche, which means polecat. All the French-Canadian trappers up in Canada. The migratory hamster doesn't migrate, but it's just cute as a button.
Yeah.
And I will always remember that image.
Was that in Mongolia?
No, this is in Pakistan.
Okay, because I've seen them in Mongolia. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Fantastic. That's excellent.
And what about the aquatic genet? Would you like to join us on a trip to look for that? That's one I really want to see. It's got to be on your bucket list still.
It's still on my list, yes. But yeah, Democratic Republic of Congo is a little dicey these days, I guess.
It's a walk in the park compared to Afghanistan, I'd have thought.
I guess. It's sort of the places I've spent a fair amount of time in New York City. I consider it very safe. But the people who don't know which neighborhoods to go in, it can be nerve-wracking.
Everywhere can be, yeah.
The aquatic genet is a sort of brownish looking genet that lives in the Congo. And for many, many, many years, I thought it was called the aquat sea genet. right? And the reason I thought it was because in my copy of the field guide of the mammals of Africa, they had dropped the I. And so I thought this was some funky name with some exotic derivation, the aquaticity genus.
Jacques Aquat. Yeah.
Finally dawned on me.
They have very bizarre behaviors. I don't know how much you know about them, but they place their faces very close to the water, and they have very long that sit on the water surface and can detect fish movement, which they'll then snatch from the water.
Oh, please stop. I can feel this overwhelming desire now to go look for these things. They sound wonderful. And I bet they're in the same place as otter shoes as well, something else I really want to see. Oh.
Yes. The Child's Education Fund has just dropped another few $1,000, I fear. Great. Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
Fantastic stories. I was fortunate enough to have spent time with you, several days with you, sometimes driving through East Africa, and you regaled me with lots of your stories. And I thought, boy, we have to get you on the podcast because some of those are just fantastic.
Well, that was one of my favorite trips. So,
yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you very much from me as well. That was just a fascinating audience with you, and I hope we can talk again about many of these things.
I hope so. We never even covered Mongolia.
No, or Papua New Guinea. Next time. Thanks, Peter.
All right.
You've been listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.